Now we're going to talk about political socialization. Just as a definition, political socialization is the complex process by which people acquire their political beliefs and values. Um, that means why they have the political point of view that they have and how they came about that. So that's political socialization. One thing to remember that's very important, that political socialization, or that process of learning your political beliefs and values, is a learning process. It's not ingrained. It's not, you're not born with it. It's not in your DNA for the most part. Uh, but it is a learning process, especially from your parents, which we'll talk about in just a little while. There's a strong correlation between political values of parents and children because of that teaching process, uh, that acquisition process. Now, the whole concept of political socialization is based in something called the primary principle and the structuring principle. The primary principle and the structuring principle. The primary principle says this, basically. It's very simple. What is learned first is learned best. Okay, the earliest things you learn. You come into this world, your brain's a little sponge for knowledge, and those things you learn early on, uh, they stick with you the longest. Language is a good example of that. The first language you learn, even though you don't know anything about language when you're born, uh, once you learn the language, you can speak the language forever. And that's in your primary language you learn at first is the one that's going to be your best language. So the primary principle concept basically means what is learned first is learned best. Now, on top of that is the structuring principle. The structuring principle states that uh, based on the primary principle, because what you learn first, you learn best, all future learning is structured upon the primary principle learning. So you see the world through your primary principle learning. So if you are taught at an early age that, liberalism is good, conservatism is bad, then as you go through life and you're confronted with these ideologies, you will immediately react in such a way, a negative reaction to maybe conservatism because you were taught that's not the proper ideology, and a positive reaction to liberal ideology because that's you were taught that was good. And those are just examples, but I'm just saying that you tend to base all of your assumptions, and you based much of your uh, much of your well, assumptions. I guess that's the best term. Your assumptions and your opinions on primary principle learning because you learned that first, and so you look at everything through those glasses and through that through those concepts. Now, when speaking of political socialization, there are certain agents of socialization. Agents of socialization, and basically these are the institutions, the uh, the things we encounter in life that socialize us, that teach us our values and beliefs. The first and most important agent of socialization is the family. Okay, the family has more impact on your political values and beliefs than any other thing on earth. Uh, why? Well, they're the first people you come in contact with as a child, and we go back to the primary principle: what is first learned is first best. What is learned first is learned best, and so the first things you learn are from your family. So those are the things you learn best. You trust your family, you trust your parents, you trust your grandparents, and the things they tell you when you're a child, you take them to heart. Uh, they exhibit values. They show you how to interact with other people, be it good or bad. Um, the things that you watch everything your parents and your aunts and uncles and grandparents do, and you learn from it. You look at how they treat other people, uh, either good or bad. Uh, and it's not necessarily overt socialization. A lot of it is just subtle socialization, just learning by watching your parents, learning by watching your family. Uh, I argue that nobody is born a racist. Yet when you where do we learn that? Well, I would argue that most people that are racist, their families are, because it's just something that they're taught as a young child. They see how their parents and their family talk about and interact with other people, and they learn it and they think that's the right and proper way to do it. And so or in another aspect, I mean, think about it this way: when you look at little kids in preschool or at daycare, and you watch them play on the playground together, they all play together and have fun and interact, and they really don't see color. It's just they're just kids. But it's later on when the teaching takes hold that some differences can take hold. So it's a lot of it's subtle. You don't realize you're doing it as a parent, but it just happens because your child is watching everything you do. That's why you need to be very careful about how you act around your child, because they will remember everything. I know I have a young child and she remembers everything I say. And as I mentioned earlier, uh, party identification, the greatest predictor of party identification of any person is their parents' party identification. Chances are, if you're listening to this, if you identify with a political party, Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, whatever, there's probably about a 90 to 95% chance that your parents identify with the same political party. So family is the first and most important agent of socialization. The Another agent of socialization, and really the second agent of socialization, is school. Because, I mean, once you're at a certain age, either 2 or 3 for preschool or 5 or so for kindergarten, then you enter into the school system. In most schools, most people that enter the school system are entering a public school system. And, uh, and the school systems socialize you. But they don't socialize you specifically. Generally, they shouldn't socialize you to adhere to a specific ideology or a specific political party. What they teach you is the concepts, the larger American concepts. The uh, they, they teach you the symbols and heroes of the nation. Or at an early age, you learn about the flag. Well, the very first thing you do from the time you're in kindergarten that you learn how to do, and you do it all the way through the 12th grade, is you do the Pledge of Allegiance. That's symbolic. You are symbolizing your loyalty to the nation by pledging allegiance. Kindergarten and first graders don't even know what Pledge of Allegiance means. They just say it. But it is a part of the socialization process, and all countries do it. All countries, through their school systems, socialize their children to support and adhere to their systems, their political systems, their economic systems. And so we teach by symbols. The White House is a symbol. We talk about the heroes, and we extol the values of these heroes like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King. And it doesn't have to be political heroes. It can be economic heroes: Henry Ford, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, whoever you want to think about. We hold these people up as heroes, and you know, uh, great immigration stories like Andrew Carnegie from Scotland, who comes over and becomes one of the richest men in the world. Um, but we're taught at an early age, elementary school, and even in the middle school, about these heroes. We're also taught about the systems that we have. We talk about democracy and representative democracy, and how we choose. We're free to choose in an election the people we want to make our laws. Okay, we learn about our economic systems. We learn about capitalism and free enterprise, and we talk about how they're wonderful things, and they make people rich, and they give everybody an equal chance to succeed. And these are the things we're taught in order for, and this is all primary principle learning for the most part, in order to teach us to hold to embrace the systems and the values of the nation. We're taught about talk about the Industrial Revolution when we're in elementary and middle school, and in the Industrial Revolution, of course, we're taught that it was probably the greatest economic innovation and entrepreneurism in world history, where we transitioned as a nation from an agricultural to an industrial economy, created great wealth, all these things. Later, when you get into high school, depending on your teachers, a lot of times, you will begin to analyze and critique your early learning. Instead of just extolling the values and saying everything is great about America, you'll start looking at it and looking at the different things and the different systems and the different people, and you will start analyzing what they did and how they did it, and you'll find things to criticize. You'll find out that George Washington and all the founding fathers, even though they, and Thomas Jefferson especially, excuse me, wrote the Declaration of Independence, talking about equality of all men, and they're all slave owners. So you start analyzing this and seeing the contradictions and the hypocrisy. You look at the excuse me, look at the Industrial Revolution that we just talked about. How it was a wonderful thing. You learn it in the early years. It's a wonderful thing, but when you start critiquing it, you start understanding that while we did create great wealth, we created it, on the backs of child labor, exploited immigrant labor, horrible, horrible working conditions, and absolutely no regard for the environment and pollution and what we were doing to our world. So you get to start really analyzing your primary principle learning. But here's the thing, because it's primary principle learning and that primary principle learning was positive, democracy is good, free market capitalism is good. When we start criticizing it, we don't reject it because our primary principle learning was that it was good. So we're able to criticize it without rejecting it. And then college, especially if you move off to another town, a larger city, a true college town, maybe something like Austin or maybe College Station, or any place that's a major university, it can have a very liberalizing effect on you because you're exposed to people that maybe you've never been exposed to before, and you'll come into contact with people that you had predetermined assumptions about because of what you saw on the media about them. And it can be gay people, it can be Muslims, it can be whoever. But what'll happen is you'll be exposed to people, and you might change your mind about your previous assumptions, and can be very shocking for some people to realize that you're going to be sitting in class with maybe a couple of Muslim students, and at first you're going to be fearful of them because that you're taught through the media subtly and overtly both that they're all terrorists, and it's a they should be feared. And then what you'll find out is, well, a lot of them are just students like you trying to pass class and having the same kind of issues that other college students have with getting a job and dating and everything else. So and it can be a shock to some people's system when they are exposed to this. But it'll also make you open your mind and liberalize your mind a little bit to thinking that, well, maybe not all people are what I was taught at home or what I was taught on the TV. Speaking of television, the media is another agent of socialization. Americans spend an inordinate amount of time watching TV, so it cannot help but have some impact on how you view the world, what you think about, and your political values and beliefs. There's overt political socialization in the media, such as election coverage. If you watch election returns in a presidential election, you see the red and the blue map, and you see all the numbers on the different states, which there are the number of electoral college votes, and you learn as you're watching that. Even if you've never studied it, you're going to learn something, and you're going to be socialized into the American political system and how it works. Debates are a good example of overt um, political socialization. Uh, they're trying to show you that you make your decision based on comparing and contrasting the ideas of the different candidates. Now we have to be careful about media though, because there is a lot of embedded bias in the media. There's ideological bias in the media, either by specific reporters or specific newspapers, or it's especially specific television news networks. And so, you have your MSNBC with the liberal bias, you have your Fox News with the conservative bias, and you have to I won't sit here and say there's anything wrong with either one, although when you do put too much bias in something, it's no longer news, now it's opinion. But just it's okay to watch Fox News, it's okay to watch MSNBC. Just recognize when you're watching it, recognize that it is biased coverage and it is biased news. Uh, Also, there is a soundbite bias, which Basically, all that means is somebody could give an entire speech that lasts 45 minutes, but the news will take about a 10-second clip or a 15-second clip, and they'll show it on the news because that is what they want people to remember about that speech. And it may be taken completely out of context, and it may seem like, well, like when I was talking about the later socialization in schools, high school socialization, when you begin to keep critiquing um, when you begin critiquing the systems and things like that. I discussed how the Industrial Revolution was built on the backs of immigrants and exploited immigrants and child labor and pollution. And if somebody wanted to make me look like an un-American jerk, they could just take that small part out of this whole audio and start showing everybody to it, and they would think I was a huge critic of American capitalism or whatever. That's soundbite. They just took a soundbite out of it and used that to kind of unfairly portray me as you know for or against something. And also, what happens is as we get more and more attuned to our own ideology, we tend to narrow our resources where we get our news. If we find one network or one newspaper that matches up with our ideology, well, that'll be our sole source for news, and it'll be very narrow, and we won't get a true other point of view. We won't get a true counter point of view because we don't want to hear things that we disagree with. And if I'm a conservative and I know I watch Fox News all the time and it tells me I'm right all the time, well, why would I go over to any other network and listen to their news when I know I disagree with it? And so I'll just ignore it, even though it's possible that the opposing point of view may be more correct. It may be right. You never know. Also, traditional and alternate sources. Traditional sources are mainly the what we call mainstream media. The major news networks, the major newspapers, and generally those can be generally thought of to be factually correct for the most part because they do check each other. They watch each other to make sure that they're being honest, and they'll call each other out if they're not. Be careful about alternate sources. I know a lot of people like to get these alternate, news websites, especially, Joe's World News, or and the thing about it is there is no check. Anybody can, with a computer, can build their own news website. Just because it says it's news doesn't mean it's true, and so you got to be careful about alternate websites. And then cultural socialization. A lot of television shows, just sitcoms or whatever shows, these reality shows, they socialize us culturally. They kind of try to persuade us and tell us how our world should be, or what's wrong with the world, or what's right with the world. And they can also attempt to change people's minds about things, to push agendas, a social agenda potentially. A good example these days, is a show called Modern Family, which has a gay couple who adopts a daughter, and they're part of this bigger family unit, and and they make it seem in the show that this is a normal family, a modern family. The name of the show says it all. This is a modern family with uh, a gay couple that's married and has a child and all this, and so what it's trying to do is trying to show you through sitcom television that these people do exist, and there are worlds out there that are like this, but you may not know it personally, and they just try to socialize you culturally, and there's all kinds of examples of that. Um, anyway, continuing with agents of socialization, church and religion are also important agents of socialization for individuals. Now, church and religion have different degrees of influence on different people. Some people make religion a very, very important process, or a very, very important part of their political decision making. Oftentimes they'll use religious values or religious dogma as what we call a litmus test for whether they support a candidate or not. And a litmus test would be something like this: if somebody says, I will only vote for a person that agrees with me on this specific issue or is of this specific religion. And if that is the case, if they make that like the most important factor and the deciding factor, then it's a litmus test. A lot of people do that. Other people have a kind of a tendency to disconnect religion from politics. They might argue that, "Yeah, I don't care what your religion is or what your, how you what you do and what your religious affiliation is. If you have a successful background, if you're qualified, if you do a good job, I'll vote for you." And they base it basically just on like policy decisions. So there's quite a bit of a gray area there between individuals, the importance individuals place on religion with regard to uh, political positions. Most churches teach the nature of society, the proper nature of society. Therefore, it does teach socialization. They teach, when you think about the nature of society, most, Christian religions, they'll teach that, a man and a woman in a marital unit is the standard or the optimum, nature of society. And that's why most people who at least this is not a statistical. I don't have any statistical evidence of this, but just in talking to people, most people who oppose gay marriage oppose it on religious grounds because to them it is not the proper nature, quote unquote, of society. A lot of the teachings of the church will filter into uh, people's political values and beliefs. Also, churches teach uh, our obligations or the obligations we have to the rest of society, how we're supposed to treat our fellow man, how we're supposed to interact with each other and help each other. And oftentimes, it's in this case, and this is my own opinion, that oftentimes people tend to selectively forget some of these teachings of our obligations to others in our society because they're politically expedient for themselves. Specifically, how in Christianity specifically, but in other religions too, I'm sure, how we're supposed to treat poor people, and oftentimes there's a little bit of a disconnect. Also, age cohort tendency, impacts of events are an agent of socialization. By that we mean um, whoever's listening to this and watching this presentation, they grew up in a cohort of people. Their peers all grew up at the same time and were exposed to the same events, the same occurrences uh, in their lives, and those events impact how you view the world. Uh, my mother's age cohort tendency that impacted her life was probably the moon landing, maybe. My grandmother's was. Did I say my grandmother? My grandmother's was the Great Depression for sure. That impacted her view of the world. Many people in their 20s right now, probably in their 30s, their worldview is impacted by the events around 9/11. And so the modern generation, I guess, if somebody, since 9/11 happened in 2001, that was 13 years ago, people, 14, 15 years old today, well, older than that, probably 16, 17, 18 years old today, probably have no memory of 9/11. They don't remember that happening. But there will be other events that happen, major events, life-altering events that happen that will impact the whole age cohort. Um, Also, social groups can impact your political values and your socialization. Uh, Higher education. If you run in a group of people with higher education, you'll adopt the values oftentimes of the people with higher education. And those tend to be more, uh, also the values of those with more money because those two are intertwined. Income, your values and beliefs about politics are impacted by how much money you make. Um, Region of the country, whatever part of the country you're raised in. In the South, you grow up to be with a more conservative ideology, with a conservative socialization. If you grow up in the Northeast, it tends to be more liberal. Um, Race and ethnicity, your um, your racial group, your family that you grow up in and around impacts your political values. It impacts your the way you view government and the role of government and the nature of government. Um, that's why, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but that's why racial minorities are much more likely to support government and a proactive government and a progressive or liberal government because those people have a long history of being oppressed by other portions of society, and the government is the one that came in and implemented protections for them. So they tend to be more open to the role of government in impacting people's lives. Gender, women and men see political issues differently oftentimes. Women tend to have a more liberal view of many policies than men. And then age. The older you get, sometimes your political socialization, your political ideas and values will change. Um, you know, Generally as we get older, statistically, we tend to get more conservative. This is a good little graphic regarding gender differences in political opinions and kind of shows the disconnect or the difference between women and men. Uh, as far as on the left there, the opinions, who wants stricter gun control laws? Only 42% of men, but 60% of women. That's an 18% difference. That is a very statistically relevant difference between gender. And we have to think about when we see these differences why they occur. Why do women generally want more stricter gun control laws than men? Favor the death penalty for those convicted of murder. 76% of men do, 62% of women. That's a 14% difference. That's still a significant difference. And the government should spend more money on the military. 55% of men believe that, 40% of women believe that. That's a 15% difference. Um, Farther on down under compassion, government should see to good jobs, standard of living. There's really not much difference there. Federal spending on welfare programs should be increased. There's a pretty significant difference there, where a pretty significant number of women over men think that we should spend more on social services and welfare programs. And government should provide health care for the sick. About a 7% difference, women over men. And government definitely or probably should help reduce differences between the rich and poor. A small difference the between men and women. This chart shows trust in government as a trust in government index, and from 0 to 80 percent that trust government on the left-hand column side, and on the row at the bottom shows the year. And as you can see, during the early 1960s, it got up to 60% average score on the trust index. People trusted the government in the late 50s and early 60s, but beginning in the mid to late 1960s, that trust began to drop. And you can trace that to a couple of historical events, namely the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal involving President Richard Nixon, and during in which the war, really came to a head with regard to protests and things like that in the middle to late 1960s, and that's where you can see the precipitous drop in trust in government. And then, of course, Watergate occurred in the early 1970s, and so you can see an even continuous drop there. Then it kind of levels out and it bounces back up. Starting about 1980, when Ronald Reagan becomes president, he kind of brings back a more trustful environment, or seemingly people tend to have more faith in the government. And then it has varied since then. It drops off 1986, and from 1994 it bottoms out again, and then begins to rise again. That peak there looks like 2000, 2001, right around 9/11, which you always get a little patriotic fervor and a little more trust in government when you're at war. Of course, that as wars drag on, that trust tends to decrease consistently and oftentimes dramatically as the wars drag on. This chart shows uh, kind of a new way of looking at ideologies. And I would encourage you to kind of read it and see maybe where you fall, which category you fall into, if you fall into any of those categories. Many people are probably kind of a combination of a couple of the four categories, but we're not going to go into it in any depth in this for our purposes. But I encourage you to kind of read over it a little bit.